Okay, so welcome back to my channel. So, Netflix, The Haunting of Bly Manor, episode 6, The Jolly Corner. So, it picks up, we finally get to see Henry Wingrave again. Obviously, he's in his office because he has not been back to the house, even to check on his own niece and nephew. So, it's the end of the night. His secretary, walks in and tells him that Dani called and she wanted to talk to him about the kids. There have been some strange things happening at the house. Nothing serious. The kids are okay, but she still needs to talk to him. And his response was, "I'm glad the kids are doing okay." And so she turns and she walks out and she left for the night. He then turns his attention to this letter that's on his desk that was delivered earlier by him. She delivered the mail to him. And there's a letter addressed to Dominic, his brother that died. And so he's now looking at this letter. And then for some reason he looks up. And of course we see the direction he's staring in. And it just seems to be like a little table and 2 chairs. And no sooner than he swivels in his chair, you can kind of see, and it looks like someone is standing there now. And then, as it becomes clear, we realize that, okay, in fact, someone is actually standing there. So he walks over to the bar, and the next thing you know, he turns and he says, scotch or vodka, something he asked, I don't know, gin or vodka, something like that. And so as he turns to walk away, you see that there's no one there again. He walks out to the little table and the 2 chairs with 1 glass, and he pours a drink. And the next thing you know, you see an arm comes out from nowhere, and the person picks up the drink. And then, of course, we get to see who this individual is, and it looks like Henry Wingrave. So he takes a drink, has this odd grin on his face. He puts the glass down. Henry picks the glass up. And then it's flashed to a car speeding up the road. And then we realize that it's Lord Wingrave. He's racing home because Charlotte, his wife, is in labor with Flora. Now, one thing that I noticed when during this scene is when Lord Wingrave walked into the room. Of course, he's comforting her, and I just wanted to make sure my girls are okay. It looked like Charlotte was looking away from him, and then you flash to Henry, and it's almost like he was hesitant to leave the room, like he felt like he should be there. And then it's like, so what's this about? Okay, so Flora, she wakes up in the woods, and you can tell she's confused. She really has no idea how she got there. And then it flashed to Jamie and Dani. So, Jamie, she's just there doing her job. Dani walks in and, with 2 cups of coffee, but really she wanted to talk to her and about what happened. And, she wanted to kind of smooth things over. She ends up, basically saying that she, really wants to see where things go. And Jamie's kind of hesitant. She was like, yeah, I kind of feel that way, but it seems like when I get too close, then you pull away because you're unsure and this whole thing. And so eventually she ends up asking Jamie out for a drink. He said we could just, away from here, away from everything, we could just go. It'll be just, be us. We could just go to some boring pub because Jamie did say she liked her life boring. Like, she just didn't want, I guess, whatever complications she think Dani's about to bring. She's like, I just like my life nice, simple, and boring. And so Dave's like, we have a nice boring drink at a nice boring pub. And then Jamie started to talk. I have a flat. My flat is over that boring pub. She was like, yeah, but of course you already knew that. And so they talked a little bit, and then Dani saw Flora in the woods, and of course, you can see she ran out to get her, and you can see Flora, she's walking somewhere. Dani stops her, and of course she's talking to her, trying to figure out, like, what are you doing out here? How long have you been out here? And then she does it again, where her eyes kind of shifts to the side, like she's waiting for someone to tell her what to say. And then we see Rebecca standing there. And then it's like, okay, well, Flora, how long have you been out here? And she was like, I don't know. I really don't know. And then Rebecca touches Flora's forehead, and she wakes up in her bed. And of course, she's still like, kind of like confused, like, how did I get here? And then she turns over and you see that the dollhouse is no longer there. And she looks at the foot of her bed, and there's something there that just disappeared really quickly, right? And so, of course, as soon as she crawls to the foot of her bed, there's nothing there. She hears the door. She looks over. It appears to be this child standing at the door, and she's talking to this child. And, you know, who are you? Like, where'd you come from? My name is Flora, being her normal self. She touched the child on the shoulder. The child turned around, and this child has no face. So, of course, she bolted down the hall to her mama and them's room, right? And she's like, there's someone in my room. There's a boy in my room. And so, of course, the mom initially thought that it was Miles scaring her. And she was like, no, it wasn't Miles. And the next thing you see is Uncle Henry putting his clothes on. Like, okay, So I'm like, I knew that look meant something, right? And so she says, Uncle Henry, what are you doing here? Right? And so, of course, the mom steps aside, and she now has a clear view of him. And so he walks over and is like, oh, well, you know, I decided not to drive back in town last night. And then the mom was like, oh, he just stayed over. And so she grabs the mom and pulls them down the hall to her room. And of course, the mom is doing the inspection, and she's looking around and was like, well, see, there's nothing there. And, you know, they start talking to her. And she said, well, it was something strange about it. Like, it didn't have a face. Like, the face was incomplete. And it was like, huh? And she was like, yeah. And they said, oh, well, maybe the mom was like, well, since you're the only person that can see it, maybe he just wants to be your friend. And then she was like, how can it be friends? You know, he doesn't have a mouth. And then Henry was like, well, if he doesn't have a mouth, that means that he must be a very good listener. And that is a very important, that's very important in the friendship. And so they're talking to her about being friends with this thing. I mean, obviously they're talking about it because they don't really believe this person exists. But still, of course, us as the viewing audience, like, oh my God, they're telling her to befriend whatever this entity is, okay? And so there's like, well, they said, well, why don't you give it a name and a backstory? And she's like, you know, and then he started talking about, you know, he had a friend similar to that when he was a kid growing up in that house. It was a soldier, and that's what he did. And that's how he stopped being afraid of it. And she's like, oh, well, you know, okay, of course, you know, that sounds like a good idea. So her mom tucks her in the bed, and, you know, they started talking. She asked her, well, when Dad's coming back? He's in Scotland at this point. And she's like, oh, he'll be back soon. And then she was like, you know, something feels strange. And the mom was like, oh, does it? She was like, I feel like I'm too old. And then the mom was like, well, and actually Henry was like, well, and you know why? And she was like, the mom was like, well, you are too old. You were 5 years old when this happened. And she was like, well, I know I was 5 years old, but I'm not 5 years old. I'm 8 years old. And he was like, well, why do you think that is? And she was like, oh, it's a memory. And she was like, you know, I've gotten stuck in another memory. You know, it's been happening more and more. And it seems like just as I, you know, figure it out, and then you see her doze off, and then she wakes up in her bed with Dani and Jamie kind of looking over her. So we flash back to Henry in his office. His secretary comes in again saying that Dani called, that, you know, there's still an issue with Flora. And, you know, initially he still kind of brushed it off. But he did eventually call the house. And Flora answered the phone. And she was like, Flora residence. And so she, you know, started talking about the entity, and, you know, how her dad said it was a figment of her imagination. And he said that you should tell your dad that it's a figment of his imagination. And she was like, oh, you could tell him yourself. And so he was kind of shocked. He was like, oh, he's there? And so he got on the phone. And so, you know, he got on the phone and he was like, yeah, so what's going on? So they talked a little bit, and he was like, well, wait a minute, how did you know that I was home? Because, you know, I just got in, and, you know, he thought it was odd that he just called out of the blue. And of course he had to try to think of something on the slide, like, oh, well, I called I forget, was he in Scotland? I forget where he was. And he said, and they said that you had moved, that you weren't there. And I thought maybe you had moved hotel. So I was calling to talk to Charlotte to see if you had moved. And he was like, oh, well, no. And you see, I'm home now. And he said, so what was the problem? He said, oh, no, in the midst of trying to, find you, I was able to figure it out on my own. And he was like, oh, okay. So I guess I'll talk to you later. And so as you can see, Charlotte was standing. She kind of stopped while he was on the phone, and when he hung the phone up, she walked away, and he kind of looked over and was starting to, like, you could see his brain, his wheels were spinning, like, okay, something's not right here. And so we flashback, it's jumped forward to Henry. He's still in his office, but it's later, he's still looking at this letter addressed to Dominic. And he was about to pour himself a drink, and he was about to drink and realized his glass was empty, and he's trying to decide whether he's going to do bourbon, and there's something else there on the desk, and he looks over, and then he sees this person sitting in the corner. He was like, there's really no need for you to hide. You may as well come on out. So he came out, and he took the glass from him, and they talked a little bit, and he was like, oh, bourbon, and it was something else. And then he was looking at the year of the look. He said, you act like you have money, like Peter didn't steal over $250,000 from you. Well, I should say of Mal's money. And so Henry was like, well, I put that money back. No idea, so I don't even know why you bringing it up. And then he starts asking him about the letter, and it's like, why haven't you sent out notice of death to people? You could easily have your secretary, take care of this, so you could stop receiving these letters. And, the reason you really don't want to do this is because for each letter you send out, you have to come to the realization that your brother is dead, and you're in denial. And, of course, they're going back and forth, and, it was just a whole mess. So Dani and Hannah, she's watching over Flora, and they're talking, and Dani says that I called Henry, and he never called me back. And Hannah was like, 3 people died that day. He granted, obviously Lord and Lady died, but he's not been the same since, and he's just been a different person ever since they died. And Hannah, asked if she wanted to come down and have a cup of tea or something. She's like, I'll be there in a minute. So Hannah goes on ahead, and she goes over just to check to see, make sure that Flora was comfortable. And as she was leaving, you could see the little boy with no face was sitting at the dollhouse, and you can see her face, like she's like, did I see something or did I not see something? Like, you see, her mind is going right, but of course by the time she turned around, there was nothing there. And so of course she's thinking, okay, my mind is playing tricks on me, nothing was there, it's all good. So she came downstairs to the kitchen, and Hannah and Owen are sitting talking, and she's like, oh, I thought you had left already. And he was like, well, somebody asked me to stay. And so you kind of saw this little grin on Hannah's face. And eventually Jamie walked in, and she asked her if she wanted to have a boring night. Now, if you remember, earlier the discussion was about them having a drink and, to keep things boring, and, that whole thing. And so she was like, well, I can't, she was worried about leaving Flora. And Owen and Hannah was like, oh, we'll keep an eye out for them, and you should go and have a good time. And so of course Jamie just went on and grabbed her and pulled her on outside. So they end up in the woods, right? So Dani's like, okay, so did you bring me out here to kill me? She was like, I just might if you keep talking. So she starts talking about this flower. And what's it called? It's called the moon star or moon something other. And she was like, it doesn't really grow there, and it takes a lot of work to cultivate, and it only blooms twice a year. And she said, but in 3 weeks, that flower, the flower will be dead, and by spring she'll have to plant new ones. And so Dani is like, well, that's a lot of work for a flower that only blooms once a year. And she was like, yeah, that's just how, that's how I see people. Sometimes, you put in a lot and you don't get very much in return. And they started talking, and Jamie started talking about, she said, so let's just get this out of the way, you know. So she started talking about her background, and she started talking about, you know, her parents and how her father worked in the coal mine, and, you know, her father worked hard and he was a good guy, and her mother was having affairs, and then she was like, he would go down and he would work, and then he would come up, and then the people would be laughing at him because they knew that her brother wasn't his, and it was just a whole situation. And then, you know, they felt that the father was stupid and the mama was a whore, and they basically said as much. And she said she would hear it at school and in the streets, and eventually around in her late 60s, I think she said the mom just up and left the kids. And she said in 67, I think she said in 67, the mom just up and left, and now she's, you know, trying to help take care of the kids, and then she, you know, but she's a kid herself, and then she has a pot. She forget about the pot, a pot that's boiling on the stove, and then there's an accident, and then, you know, Child Protective Services get involved, and, you know, their father's trying to do the best they can. They end up in foster care, and then eventually she leaves, and she spends a couple of years behind bars for various crimes, and like, she's had, you know, a tumultuous time, but she's always talked about that's where she learned about gardening, and that's where her love of flowers, you know, came from. And it was a whole speech. If you want all the details of that, you would have to watch the episode. But that was pretty much the gist of it, and how, you know, whenever something dies, something beautiful grows in its place, and that's why she loves flowers. And it was this whole thing. And then she tells Dani, she was like, I know that you feel guilty, but you are not in control of when people die. She was, you know, like, we're organic, you know, we die. It's just something that's natural, and it's just something that, you know, it is what it is. You have no control over that. I know you feel guilty, but you shouldn't. And, you know, they had a nice little conversation, and of course it ended with them, you know, having a little entanglement. Okay. So we flash to Henry. He's in his office, and he was clearly in love with Lady Wingrave, and so he's like sleeping on the couch, and he's kissing her, or at least he thinks he's kissing her. And then the next scene, you see him looking at himself, which was I can imagine extremely creepy, right? And then you flash, there's another memory of when he got the dollhouse for Flora. It was her birthday. Peter actually helped him bring it in and put it together. And of course, eventually, Lady Wingrave came through, and she was like, "Oh, this is beautiful. She's going to love it." Da, da, da. And then they're having this whole moment where he put his hands up and they're kind of touching, and she was like, "Well, not now. This is not the right time or place." And of course, you know, Lord Wingrave is standing at the top of the stairs, and now we don't know how long he's been standing there, but they was acting guilty of sin, and she's like, "Oh, well, honey, look at what Henry brought. It was just so guilty," right? And he's standing there, and you can just kind of see that he's just not here for the BS, right? And so eventually Henry leaves, and then, you know, after he left, she kind of turns and look at her husband. They don't really say anything, and then she walks off, and he's kind of standing there like, what? Okay, there's something going on here. He's still, you know, trying to put some stuff together, right? And so later that night, you know, I guess she came down to get something to drink before she going to bed, and Lord Wingrave, he was just sitting in the kitchen thinking, and he kind of startled her because he was in the dark. And so she walked over to the refrigerator and started talking about how she need to try to mentally prepare herself because all the kids are going to be there because it's Flora's birthday. And then he started talking about Flora's birth, and he was like, I knew something was off about it, and how, you know, she came early, and you can see her facial expression change, like, okay, he's figuring things out. And so she walks over to the table, and like, what are you talking about? And then she sits down, and he starts telling her, like, I was in Russia around that time, and he was like, the time's just not adding up. And, you know, as they talk, you can tell that she starts crying. And he was like, for 6 years, you know, I've been living this lie and, you know, this whole thing. And she's not my daughter. And then she started crying. And it was a whole thing. And then he asked the dreaded question, do you love him? And she didn't say anything. All she did was start crying. And so, of course, that meant yes. And so they just both sat there at the table and they just cried. So it's the next morning. Jamie and Dani wake up together. And Dani noticed that there are some burn scars or some kind of scars on Jamie's back. But, she let her sleep and she got up to get dressed. And, of course, she went to the window and she could see Flora standing outside. And so, of course, she run out to see what are you doing? Why are you out here again? And so Flora's like, I don't really know what's going on. Why am I out here? What is going on? And, of course, her gaze moves to the side. And, of course, you see Rebecca standing there. And as she's talking, Rebecca walks over and touches her again, and then you realize that it's not just Peter using Miles. Rebecca has been using or possessing or whatever they do. She's been doing the same thing to Flora, and you saw that because the minute she touched Flora's behavior completely changed. Like, and the thing is, and I want people to leave this in the comment section. Before seeing this episode, did you really see a change in Flora's behavior? Was it a noticeable change where you figure something? What did you think that something was wrong with Flora before seeing this episode? Because obviously her transition wasn't nearly as drastic as Miles when he would just fly off the handle and flash on people, and so it wasn't as overt. So I don't know if I hadn't seen this episode, if I would have even realized that Rebecca was manipulating Flora. Even though I knew she was talking to somebody, but I didn't know that was happening to her. And so her entire attitude, behavior even changed. Even Dani's facial expression changed. She's like, I'm so sorry that I inconvenienced everyone. And she said, let's go and have breakfast. I'm absolutely famished, right? And so Dani is sitting there confused, like, what in the world just happened? So he wakes up and he's in his office, hungover again. His secretary comes in again to say that Dani called and she really needs to talk to him about Flora. And he's like, is somebody dying? Does somebody need an ambulance? And she was like, no, I don't think it's that simple. And he flashes on her like, I told you that if somebody's not sick and in an ambulance, then don't bother me. And so she walked out. And he decides, he thought about it. And he got up to walk out. And as soon as he opened the door and stepped to the other side, it was a flash. He went back. And so he realized, there's all these people in here. They're moving stuff around, packing stuff up. And then he's like, what is going on here? And then you realize, this is when the showdown happened between him and his brother. His brother basically told him that I know what's going on between you and my wife. And this is when he told him about Flora, because at this point he had no idea. He didn't know that Flora was his daughter. So when Lord Wingrave told him, he was shocked, and Lord Wingrave basically told him that this guy felt about him that he was a snake, that he was a demon, and that he was banished, that he is not to ever step foot in Bly Manor again, that he's not to talk to his wife or his children. You do not have a niece or nephew. You do not have a brother. You are just you. And I hope that you're able to live with yourself as shitty as you are. And they, you can see he crumbled. He was like, you can only just see the pain on Lord Wingrave's face at the betrayal, right? And so he said what he needed to say, and he walked off. And then we see Lady Wingrave, and she's packing for the trip, and this is the trip where obviously they did not come home. And so she's packing, and Flora's there talking to her, and it's like, I want to go with you, and I don't want to stay here with Miles and Mrs. Grose and And so the mom the mom is actually the one that gave her the talisman. And she was talking about how she used to make them when she was a kid. And sometimes, she still do, because, that habits die hard, and they're there to protect you. And then they talked for a while, and she realized that she was in a dream. She realized that she was, as she calls it, tucked away again. And she turns to her mom and she said, Mom, I do miss you. I really miss you. And so she tells her, you should wake up now. And so she's back in her room and she wakes up and she goes downstairs. Now at this point they're all sitting around having dinner. And so she comes out and she is like, what are you guys doing? Like, she's really upset. Like, how could you have dinner without me? And so they all turn real confused. And it's like, well, Flora, you ate. You know, we brought you the dinner to your room and you ate and you went back to sleep. And so Miles turns around and was like, you know, she's acting weird. But I don't know if that was Miles or if that was Peter. Who the hell knows? Just by his facial expression, it seemed like it was Peter. And so Flora standing there was like, I don't remember, and I don't like this game anymore. I don't like this game anymore, right? And so at this time, the phone rings. Dani gets up to answer the phone, and then we realize that it's been Wingrave, Henry, calling the house and hanging up. And there was another flashback. So there's a knock at the door, and he gets up to answer the door, and Lady Wingrave is standing there, and she's telling him how she's, going to work for her marriage, and they're taking this trip so that they can figure things out for their marriage, and that she's not going to leave her husband, and she wants to work on keeping her family together. And of course, she's saying that she do care for him, but she has to do what's best for her family. And of course, he's her, and they kiss and they say their goodbyes. And she walks out. He follows her out, and then of course he's back in present day. And then you see this bright light, and he turns to see the light, and then his self is saying, and then you know what happens next, right? And what happens next is the next memory is the phone call. The phone call is obviously the phone call he received telling him that his brother and sister-in-law had been killed. And this is also the first time where he actually faced himself. So out of the shock, he turns, he drops the phone. It's like, you must be mistaken. He dropped the phone. He turns around and he's looking dead at himself. Of course, he is scared to death. And that's where it started. Because his brother did say, I think that's enough punishment for you to live with yourself. So we're back at the house. Dani has Flora all tucked in again, and she's standing outside in the hallway talking to Jamie. And Jamie was like, she's sleepwalking. She's talking in her sleep, and Dani was like, you know what? I think I'm going to call a doctor, take her to a doctor tomorrow. And Jamie was like, I think, she needs therapy. And she talked about how, when she was having the issues that she was having, and how, she didn't really believe in therapy either until she started going, and she noticed that she started sleeping a lot better. And so, Dani was like, you could stay. So, but Jamie was like, no, I should probably go and change my clothes. She was wearing the same clothes she had on the night before. She was like, well, you could come back. And she was like, no, that's nice. Seems like you have your hands full. And she was like, okay, so, but we can definitely do this again some other time. She said, well, I'm going to be up all night. If you decide you want to come back, stop by. And so they kiss and they say their goodbyes. And so, we're back in the office, and he is sitting there for a while. This is Henry, and he decides he's going to call the house. Okay, but this time he calls the house, it's saying it's disconnected. So now he's concerned, and the other him is saying, well, what's the problem? He said, well, the problem is it's never been disconnected before. It shouldn't be disconnected. And so Henry decides that he's going to go to the house. And his other self was like, are you serious? Are you mad? Like, why would you do that? It's a 3-hour drive, and you've been drinking for, it looked like he was about to say all day, but he was like, you've been drinking, let's be real, for 2 years. And, why would you go out there now? He was like, there's something going on. And then he said, okay, so what are you going to do what are you going to say when you get there? Are you going to say that you're the reason their parents' marriage was in trouble? Are you going to tell them tell Flora that you're her dad? Like, he's like really sticking it to him. And he brushed on past them and he leaves to go to the house to check on everybody. And so at this point, Flora is waking up. She wakes up and she sees the little boy playing in her dollhouse. And he jumps up and he runs. Of course, she chased after him. She ends up in the attic. And she see him hiding amongst the dolls. And then she was like, okay, so she, apologized for scaring him before. And was like, I'm going to give you a name and give you a story. And And so then she took it was another doll that had a broken face. So she took that face off and put it on the boy, which I have to say is actually more terrifying than the boy's actual face. And then she realized again that she was dreaming. Or as she calls it, tucked away. And then she was like, I'm tired of you. Like, why are you doing this to me? Why do you keep pushing me aside, Miss Jessel? So now she's aware of, who's doing what, right? And it seems like she seems to be a lot more self-aware than Miles. At least that's how it's being portrayed. And so she wakes up and she's like, Miss Jessel, why are you doing this to me? I don't want to play this anymore. I want to talk to you. And So Miss Jessel appears in front of her and she's like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to me? And Miss Jessel was like, what do you mean? Everything is fine. She was like, no, everything is not fine. I'm tired of forgetting things. I'm tired of being tucked away. I'm tired of Miles acting strange. I'm tired of Miles being perfectly splendid, except when he's not. And so she was like, well, not what? Not Miles. And then you see Miss Jessel's face kind of changed. I thought maybe her face changed because she was like, okay, what's going on here? But as the episode progressed, I'm going to get into that. So Miss Jessel disappears and and Flora was like, no, come back. I want to finish talking to you. So, but of course, she's loud, which draws the attention of Dani. So Dani walks in, opens the door, and now she sees the dead Miss Jessel sitting on Flora's bed. And of course, she looked like she is like she about to shoot herself. So she tells Flora to come to her. So Flora goes over to her. She goes out to the hallway. She's now screaming for Miles to come out of his room. But who does she see? She sees Peter. And Peter was like, oh, well, this is awkward. So while she's distracted, Rebecca goes up behind them. She, I guess, possesses Flora. Flora runs off. Of course, Dani gave chase. They're now in the attic. She's calling for Flora. She sees Flora, and she was like, we need to leave. And while her back is turned, Miles/Peter not hits Dani in the head with something. And that's how this episode ends. So we don't know if Dani is alive or dead. Very interesting, but okay. Like I said, these episodes have been slow, and it seemed like they pick up in like the last 20-15 minutes, whatever the case may be. Now back to Rebecca's facial expression. I thought that she was making that face because, she was trying to confuse about what was going on with Miles. But it seems like she was making that face because Flora was now aware that something was going on with Miles. So then there's been a change in Miles. So I'm going to end this here, and I guess I will talk to you guys later.